special cover story podcast. I have with me Professor Jenny George. She is the Dean at the Melbourne Business School and the Co-Dean at the University of Melbourne Faculty of Business and Economics. Welcome to this conversation, Jenny, and it's good to have you here in India. And I heard you speaking about AI at our NXT conclave. A little more conversation on that and some questions on that, on the use of AI and how one has to be careful of what I call the AI trap. Don't let us govern it and don't let it be governing us. And you spoke a bit about that.
Yes, it's something I'm really passionate about. AI has so much opportunity to make life better for so many people, but only if we make sure that there's a human in the loop. This is talked about a lot, but I see things on the ground, and the on-the-ground reality is not yet what we wish it would be. And I think that having very clear guidelines about human beings being in charge of the way we deploy AI is incredibly important.
So what is the role of humans? Because we have all these conversations on how our jobs are going to be taken away. But then people say, don't worry, same argument was given when computers first came in, when cars first came in, and somebody said, horses felt threatened. So how do humans don't become horses? How do we don't get threatened?
There are many examples through human history of massive technological change, but humans have never become obsolete through that change.
In fact, the conclave is on humankind. That's our focus. So I think your tone is very reassuring.
It is. But those transformations have not been without their fallout. And so I think it's also true that there will be certain industries which will massively change. There'll be certain jobs, maybe that don't go away completely, but where the way that people do those jobs changes in a very big way. My great-grandfather was a cab driver, and at the time, a cab driver meant you drove a horse and cab. It's a handsome cab. You were a horse kind of person. Now, being a cab driver now is completely different, even though you're still getting people from one place to another. So your job might change dramatically, and yet some of the same tasks are still needed. I think what we see with AI, which is very interesting, is firstly that it does its best work when it augments human expertise. And so that's often where we're seeing huge productivity advances. What's the difficulty, I think, for us is how do we get human expertise to the level where that augmentation really matters and where the productivity really comes into play. And that's going to be a challenge for all of us, particularly in management and in education, because I think we're going to have to think about a different way of educating people, firstly, but also a different job or role that we're educating for. And that's pretty unknown at this stage.
Okay, it's not. The last word has thrown me off guard because my next question would be, you're also the Dean at the University of Melbourne. So what is the advice you would give to young kids in terms of career opportunities? I'm struggling with one. I have a nephew who's in class 9 and he wants to be an aeronautical engineer. So I don't know whether I should tell him go ahead or wait because some machine is going to do your job in the next 4 years. So think of something else.
I think change, no matter how rapid it feels at the moment, often takes longer to arrive than we think. So firstly, even those huge social changes that have happened over many centuries when there's been big technological disruption, they've often taken decades to actually finally embed. So firstly, I think anyone who's in year 9, it's unlikely that by the time you reach university, the entire world will have completely turned on its head.
Have you met Donald Trump?
Well, geopolitics aside, okay. I think technology doesn't move quite that fast. And that's because human beings can only implement change at the speed that we can absorb it. And that's not instant. So I do suspect that it will take longer for these things to actually embed on the ground than perhaps we fear. So that's the first thing for a young person. But secondly, jobs will not disappear. Expertise will not disappear. The main thing is to become very good at, comfortable with and used to using AI as an augmenting technology, because I think that skill set will absolutely pervade all of the different roles that someone might choose to have.
So just a little bit of layman's information from you. For instance, if someone gave me a tip and I want to check that through with you, if I'm using Grok or ChatGPT, you should give them specific instructions, in the supervisory role, that if you were a travel agent, which plane should I take for my next trip to Indonesia or something? Yes. Do you need, what are the specific prompts and that only a human can give?
So one of the things that AI doesn't know until you tell it is context.
All right.
So human context is an incredibly important part of getting good results from whatever AI you use. That's actually true of any data analytics platform, not just generative AI. Any kind of algorithm that you build will not know the context. It's maths. It's a series of mathematical equations. It's an algorithm. No matter how magical it looks, fundamentally that's what it is. And the context into which those equations are then being kind of asked to come up with predictions, that's something only you can supply. So supplying context is one of the main things that you have to do when you interact with any AI system. And that means, of course, when you're prompting, that one of the main ways you get good answers is by giving as much context as possible. Who's the advice for? What's the context for it? What are all of the other things that you're considering in the mix here? What are the trade-offs? As much of that can go into the prompt that you give is the helpful way of getting the best possible answer.
So the human touch is definitely, as you said, essential in all this. So would you then look at, again, career options, a data analyzer, or, are those that steps needed, someone who can interpret data, someone who knows how to use AI? What are the career options?
Well, data analytics is more and more the technical, statistical bits of it, if you like, are really very, very well done by AI. So to the extent that, if you like, many of the heavy data science roles were doing jobs that AI can now do, there is a bit more of a limited market for some of that. But, of course, context is everything. And so what you want is someone who understands the quite complicated analytics that is going on in an AI system, but then is able to interpret it and correctly decide and use judgment about whether or not that output is appropriate for the particular context that you're in. And that's a really interesting mix of skills. You do want some analytics. You want to not be stupid about the way that you are thinking about this data and the answer that you've got, but you also need to understand what's the company, what's the country, what's the context in which this advice might be playing out, and how do you use the best judgment about whether this particular piece of analysis that's come out is the thing that you're going to make a decision based on, and how is that decision going to be used.
So context is important, and where does experience come in? Because AI are humans going to have more experience? Because there is also the personal judgment. I think that's what I'm looking at. For instance, especially in medical, if you're doing a diagnosis, AI will tell you something, but it's, I think, the innate knowledge of the person who's experienced cases who would be able to interpret that better. Will that remain?
Radiology is a great example of this, where in one sense, radiology is now exceptionally well understood and put into some very sophisticated AI models. And yet there's no lack of work for radiologists. But the interesting thing about quite a lot of that is that human radiologists, are most useful when something's very unusual. The problem with that, and this is the problem for those of us in education, is how do people become experienced radiologists if all of the basic radiology is now done by AI? How do you get up that experience curve in a world in which you don't get the basic experience anymore? And you need those 10 experts in the world who are the only people who can really interpret this very unusual edge case that AI can't, because it doesn't have the data, it hasn't seen it before. And the humans do have the ability to do that. Where will we find the next 10 world experts if we're not producing any of the basic sort of radiology? So that's an interesting question that higher education hasn't yet solved, partly because we haven't yet encountered the problem. We've still got plenty of human experts in the world. In 20 years' time, will we still have them? And how will we make sure that we're creating enough experts to be the judge at the edge case? I do not know the answer to that. I think there's a number of different ways I can imagine that we get there.
So an offshoot of AI is also the whole impact of bringing up kids in this digital world, digital nomads. They don't experience the physical pleasures of life, of playing a game, playing football. They're all at it on their, PlayStations or whatever you call them.
Yes, I have a 14-year-old who loves her, Nintendo as well.
So how do you get her to go outside and do what we did?
I think as a parent, you always make choices for your children. and you just have to make choices to say you are able to do this or not able to do this. Until this year, my 14-year-old did not have a phone of her own, and that, from a social media point of view, was something I was quite pleased about. And
But she wasn't.
well,
Was there peer pressure?
every other member of
Australia?
her class had a phone, but we said this is a family choice and we're making it. And like every other family choice parents make for their children, you can do that. You can choose that.
So that's a very interesting question, because point that you raised, because a lot of the impact of social media on the young, the kids argue back saying we're not always watching reels, we're learning from them, this is the new tool of education. How do you counter that argument? How did you do that? Because
I think that probably every parent in every age of the world has had this kind of conversation about something. This is our conversation. And I think, it's a combination of both saying you're not allowed to do it and just, being the parent, but also as they get older, helping them understand your thinking. What are the risks that you're running? What is the consideration that's going on in your head as you do that? And as they get older, the balance shifts between the parent's judgment and the child's judgment. And I guess the job as parent is to help develop that child's judgment as they grow, and then hopefully release them as an adult who can make those choices for themselves and is a responsible person who will make good choices. And that's, I think, what every parent is hoping will be the result of the upbringing they give their kids.
But there's also concern on the, in terms of the psychological this impact on the kids, and the fact that, you don't get more than 2-minute attention span from the kids today.
It's interesting. There's been a couple of studies about that show attention spans have not got shorter. Even though that's, I think
Whose side are you on?
Well, I'm on the side of the evidence, and the evidence in this case is, even though it seems like people's attention spans are shorter, and it certainly is true that we're seeing people watch much shorter clips and things like that. In fact, when you measure attention spans, they have not changed. Attention spans tend to change as we age anyway, but if you compare teenagers today to teenagers 30 years ago, I think was the study I saw, that there has not been a change. So I think we're more worried than we should be about some of those things.
Well said. But before we have a couple of more minutes, in terms of where do you see AI doing really good, and where do you see it doing a lot of harm? We spoke a bit about the harm, but where is the good? Where would you say in these areas it's really made an impact, and medicine would be one, I guess.
There's a few areas, probably. So medicine is is an area in which AI can have a big impact, because our human brains are not really designed to hold hundreds of different factors together. We are very good at seeing causality between a few things. We're not great at seeing patterns across hundreds of things. And that's where AI can really help. So we see diagnosis now becoming much more accurate when you can introduce more factors. A second area in which I think AI is really helpful is when it's able to de-bias. We know human biases come in decision making. If we know that, then we can help to overcome it with ways. For example, if you're selecting people for a job, we know a job interview almost always introduces bias. Right. We can't help it. We're human beings. We see someone opposite us and we judge all sorts of things in the first microsecond about that person. AI can take some of that away, but only, of course, if we program it in a way that doesn't reintroduce the old human biases because of the data we use. But it is possible to use AI in some ways where we can very thoughtfully create a way to take some of the bias we know is inherent in the way that our brains think. So I think that's another really useful area. And finally, I think just purely productivity in business. We know that automating some processes, we know that being able to do things faster and more accurately can just help with productivity and make us able actually to do more with less. And that is really now in our hands. If we can get those productivity gains, what are we going to do with it? What are we going to do with essentially the free time? If you think back 500 years, people were working very hard in order to simply feed themselves and clothe themselves. And men and women in those families were, by and large, making the clothes that they needed to wear, and that was mostly what women did, or raising the food from farming that they needed to feed themselves, and it was mostly what men did. But that was the sum total of the time that they had, largely. Now, we're able to do that in so much less time that we have much, much more that we've done with our time and our money, and we take holidays that people then never dreamed of. We do, even the poor in our world have more options than people 500 years ago. Big question for us is, if AI changes productivity, what are we going to do with the extra time, energy, and attention that we will have? Are we going to waste it, or are we going to use it on something worthwhile?
Very good question. Where will we get what will we do for money if we don't have jobs?
Oh, I think we will have jobs, but I think what those jobs are will change. And it will partly be that people will demand different things. For example, at the moment, you can go as a space tourist. Let me just take that as a very, very small thing. But very few people do it because it's very expensive. However, the very same thing 200 years ago, the thought of going on a holiday to Italy was something that people only did if they were of the absolutely kind of tiny minority. And now it's completely normal for more people. Will we just change our expectations about what life is like and what we can do? Will we all want to be space tourists in 50 years' time? And that will create a whole industry. We'll have different things to spend our money on. People will be employed. I don't think that doomsday is coming because of AI, but I'm an optimist.
Okay. On that note, one quick last question for you. In terms of universities and higher education, we've seen what is happening in the US. There's a lot of apprehension about sending kids over there. Is Australia benefiting from that?
We would be benefiting more if our government hadn't introduced fairly heavy caps on international student visas. But we are, and we're seeing a lot of interest. We've always had a lot of interest in higher education in Australia because it's got great universities and a very multicultural society. A third of all of Melbourne was born outside Australia. It's a good environment to be in, a lovely place to be. And so, yes, we're still seeing lots of interest.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this conversation, and hope to get you back on your next trip to India.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, that's it from us this week on Cover Story. See you at the same time next week.
For more such videos, subscribe to the Newsx YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.